that every dollar or rupee invested in nature actually yields a potential benefit of 8 to 9 times. So a multiplier of 8 to 9 times. Wow. The standard multiplier is about 4 to 5 times. Now, this is like doubling your economic output.
You are listening to Understanding the Future podcast. I am the host Punit Gandhi, and this podcast is developed in association with Climate Center for Cities under the National Institute of Urban Affairs and the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs. This is a podcast where we discuss about the future of work in the field of climate change, urban development, innovation, and sustainability with the help of leaders and visionaries working on ground as well as in the top management of public and private sector. Our objective is to better understand the future so that we can be prepared and intervene to enable climate actions in the urban areas.
Hello everyone, I am Punit Gandhi, the host of the podcast Understanding the Future, and today we have with us Mr. Ashok Jain, co-founder and managing director of Terracon Ecotech Private Limited, a nature-based solution company. Mr. Ashok will help us in understanding the future of urban biodiversity. Welcome to the show, Mr. Ashok.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Puneet, for scheduling this podcast. And I'm excited to share my thoughts and views with all of you.
Thank you, Mr. Ashok. So I would like to start our conversation with understanding what do we mean by urban biodiversity? Is it just flora and fauna we are talking about, or is it much more than that? If you can just help us understand those things.
Sure. So if we take biodiversity as a generic term, yes, it constitutes the flora and fauna, but it's not just flora, a compilation and the presence of flora and fauna. I think the flora and fauna make a lot more sense when they are supported by an ecosystem, right? And so you have various kinds of ecosystem that supports various species. Suppose say you have a forest ecosystem. So you can have a lot of urban forests where that becomes an ecosystem and you have a certain set of flora and fauna that actually thrive in such ecosystem. You have a wetland ecosystem, right? Like mangroves or a lake in an urban setting. Now there itself, you can have a certain set of flora and fauna that thrive under those conditions. So when this flora and fauna is combined with those ecosystems, that becomes an urban biodiversity, settings. So when we talk about the term urban biodiversity, it means the complete flora, fauna, and the associated ecosystem, and associated flora, fauna with those ecosystems that constitutes an urban biodiversity.
Okay. So if you can just give us background about, what are other different kinds of ecosystem which can combine with this flora and fauna? So one, you have already mentioned about forest ecosystem, wetland ecosystem. Any other kind of ecosystems that come into this picture?
Yeah, so, you can have various kinds of ecosystem, like there is the human settlement itself is an ecosystem. So it could be a setting of, a lot of large buildings, and within that, you have some elements of nature associated, and that becomes conducive for a certain set of fauna. So apart from, say, forest, which could be an urban forest, or could be, there is a grassland ecosystem. Like you have a complete piece of land where you only have grasses.
Yeah.
And that becomes an ecosystem, and that also is conducive for certain type of fauna, like snakes or butterflies. They love this kind of a setting. Certain types of birds, they love this grassland ecosystem.
Okay.
In fact, the nature adopts itself. Nature loves itself. So it kind of creates these small cocoons of itself where you have a certain comfortable species of both flora and fauna that coexist, and that makes that ecosystem thrive.
Okay. So how does this urban biodiversity, because biodiversity, I do understand it's important, but when we are talking about the urban context of it, how does it help the whole urban area, and what all things are the advantages of this ecosystem?
So it's very simple. We all love nature, right? Now imagine a city which is full of concrete roads, glass facades, and no trees. Compare that with an a surrounding area, which is where you have buildings, you have settlements, and it's also surrounded by the green areas, either a small forest patches or small gardens, parks, a water body to complement the flora that you have around you. Now, obviously, if you see the quality of life for you in terms of a mental well-being, it will be a much better in the second scenario where you can see trees, when you can hear the birds chirping, when you can actually take a stroll around the water body as compared to taking a stroll around a concrete road, or around a glass facade buildings or any kind of a large tall structure. So that's what nature does to all of us. If you actually look at even where we go out and seek a wellness, it will always be a place which is surrounded by nature. You want to go and visit nature. You want to enjoy the nature, and that's what it does when you come and talk about urban biodiversity, because people love to stay in an area where there is a state of happiness, there is a state of goodness, and nature gives you that. Right. So that's the difference, and that's the importance of biodiversity that brings about the life in where you are staying or where you're working.
Absolutely. It does help us in having a better quality of life. And just having this much amount of tree, I also feel is important to have good amount of carbon sequestration. Even water bodies help us have good amount of carbon sequestration. So how can we manage those carbon or pollution that comes up with this kind of ecosystem in cities?
Yes. So globally, trees are considered to be the carbon sinks, and they absorb the carbon dioxide which is emitted by humans or through any of the activities of the human beings. And cities, it's almost, the statistic says that almost 75% of the carbon emissions are generated in urban areas globally.
Wow.
So obviously, cities becomes the center of GHG emissions and carbon emissions, and that's where you need trees, because they are the ones that are going to sequester the carbon for us and release oxygen. So they help us in two ways. One, they take out carbon from the atmosphere, and then they release oxygen in lieu of that, which is what is helpful for us. So that is why there is a feeling of happiness, goodness, because you feel nice. You can breathe comfortably as compared to breathing carbon. You can actually breathe oxygen.
Absolutely.
Let's talk about the carbon sequestration. Obviously, as you have correctly put, the trees, they sequester almost 70% of the terrestrial carbon that exists. Even the oceans and wetlands, they sequester far more carbon. And if you actually if you compare the regions, I think almost 2/3 of the world, of the global surface, of the planet's surface, is actually oceans. And they become the biggest, one of the biggest, because of the marine ecosystem and the flora that exists, at the bottom of many of these oceans. They are able to absorb carbon in a huge capacity. I think almost 60 to 65% of the global carbon is actually absorbed and sequestered by the marine life. And whatever is there on the terrestrial part, which is say 1/3 of the surface, trees become your second best bet to sequester carbon.
Great. That sounds interesting. So coming exactly on those lines about trees, and we, as in Climate Smart Cities assessment framework that we also have, one activity which is now very important for every urban area is to map trees. Now, if you can just help us understand that, because your company has helped map more than 10 million trees, so you guys already know how to do it. So if you can give us a brief technicality on those lines, what is mapping of trees? How do we map it? And what all things do we map in that whole services?
So that's a very good point, Puneet. I think before we start understanding any form of life, it's very important that we actually inventorize, that form of life. It so is true with human senses. Like we must have human senses. It's very important to have a census or inventorization of trees. Now, while it's mandatory in some states, it may not be mandatory, by law in some states. But however, from ecological point of view, from planning point of view, it's an important exercise to inventorize trees. Now, how do we do it? Earlier, I think if you look at 10 years back, the tree census used to be manual. So each tree used to be physically visited, and the recordings, various attributes like height, age, birth, species identification, all these were noted on a piece of paper. However, since last 10 years, from 2009, when we initiated the first GPS-enabled tree census, and it's a completely digital tree census where the data by physically visiting each tree and all the data that you are observing or collecting regarding each tree is entered on a GPS device. Now it could be a high-end GPS device, or it could be a mobile phone. Over the last 4 or 5 years, mobile phones have become really smarter and are able to give us the GPS accuracy as good as the GPS devices. So you can choose any form of device, and you are able to enter all the attributes. And we collect almost 10 to 12 attributes of each tree, right from the canopy shape to the canopy diameter, to the fruiting that is available on that tree, including some of the important ones like height, age, girth, which helps us calculate the carbon sequestration potential for each tree. And this is how the exercise is done. Once the data is collected on the mobile phone, all that data is then uploaded onto a web-based application. We have a proprietary application which houses all this data. And this data, the web-based application then helps us cross-check the data, evaluate the data, do the analytics about the data. So we can actually filter the data that we want to find out, trees that are more than 100 years old, or to find out trees that are of ecological importance, like trees which are rare, trees which are endemic. So we can actually physically pinpoint those trees on the map. Okay. And that also helps us preparing a conservation plan, or at least intimating the local bodies as to how that they need to look after these trees because they are endemic, they are important, they are ecologically sensitive. So this is how actually tree inventorization is carried out, and it is of immense use by all the urban local bodies.
Absolutely. And I'm also assuming like this kind of information might also help in estimating the amount of water that would be required, amount of work that would be required by the local bodies to be taken up in future to manage or increase them or maintain them.
Yes, Puneet, that's correct. So the data can always be broken into various either wards or zones or divisions, depending on what the system the city follows. And then we can do a ward-wise analysis or a zone-wise analysis in terms of, we can compare it with human population. We can compare it maybe in an area, how much trees should be there as part of a norm, standard norm. The standard norm would be that, the cities need to have, say 30 to 33% trees. So you can do, a zone-wise or a section-wise analysis, whether the zones have adequate number of trees. Based on the numbers that actually do. And then you can also identify the areas or identify the gaps where the trees need to be planted, wherever you have additional space, land which is available for you for plantation. And all this comparisons and analysis is possible when you have a GPS-based tree inventorization data readily available with you, because then you are easily able to plot it on the map. And also you can plot or you can superimpose other layers, like like the population data or any other data which is of ecological importance, and then make the action plan accordingly. To give you a classic example, we are doing a urban forestry plan for one of the ULBs, and this tree inventorization data is helping us a lot, because then we are able to prepare plans at the smallest unit, 1 square kilometer area. We are able to actually evaluate where the trees are needed, where the human settlements are, where the pollution profile is, and accordingly choose the species, choose the space, and plant the trees, so that over a period of 5 to 10 years, you are able to actually secure that area. Even a minute level or a unit of 1 square kilometer zone.
Yeah.
So that's how this information really helps for city planners.
That's wonderful. Can we then do it just based on satellite, or do we also have to have human intervention of going and actually checking it, or how does that function?
So the tree inventorization that we are doing currently, it entails a detailed physical verification exercise. So each tree is physically visited. In some cases, even the photographs or the images of the trees are captured, and all the attributes are collected. And this visit is done by a trained botanist, so that he is able to identify the species, he is able to identify the problems, if there are any, with each tree. We have insisted on this exercise being carried out by trained botanists. But moving forward, as more and more ULBs take interest in carrying out this exercise, and even some industries have approached us to carry out the tree inventorization that exists in this. There is going to be a tremendous shortage of trained botanists to spread out in the field and help you with collecting physical observations. So moving forward, I think over the next 3 to 5 years or maybe more, I see that most of these inventorization processes can be carried out using a drone survey. And then, the data then can be interpreted in terms of species identification and all that. And that's how, the future is going to be of the tree inventorization. You may not need to visit each individual trees physically. But that's probably 2-3 years away, depending on how the technology progresses. But we have seen, and we have also experimented with some drone surveys where we are still finding it difficult to get that exact images to identify some species. But I'm sure the technology will improve over a period of time, and we are able to actually carry out drone surveys to finalize our data of tree inventorization.
That sounds really interesting, and I would like to come back on it again before we close. But next question I have is on mapping of water bodies, because yes, trees are more in number, but water body again are very complex. Like they can be big, they can be small, the depth of the water body and everything. So how do you map those things? What are the different physical parameters that you map of water bodies?
Interesting. Mapping of water bodies like trees, they are also, important natural resource for any area, and more so with city, where you have to actually supply water to the citizens. As also, water bodies globally are part of, the amusement center or the entertainment centers. So we have recently carried out an inventorization of water body for the MMR region, the Mumbai metropolitan region, and we've carried out this survey for say about 2,300 odd water bodies.
Wow.
Again, the team, and a diverse team, because you need a biodiversity expert, you need ideally an engineer, and also a life science student to actually go and visit the water body. And then you collect important aspects and information regarding the water body. And typically this information is, whether the water body apart from collecting, the boundary that you have to actually plot it on a map. We also collect information like whether there is an encroachment, of the water body. And in terms of whether native biodiversity that is surrounding that water body. So how ecologically sensitive the water body is in terms of becoming an important habitat for birds or even the marine or the aquatic ecosystem. We also collect information like, if any sewage water is being drained into the water body, what are the outlets for managing the floods. Whenever the water body overflows, it obviously ends up flooding, the nearby areas. So what is that mechanism? What is the tentative catchment of that water body? Is there any, encroachment or any disturbances to this catchment area? Because obviously, the more the disturbances, the water body obviously gets affected because it does not get the water during monsoon. It's not able to harvest the water. So these are several parameters, and in some key water bodies where we feel, I think the water quality is also sampled. We take samples of the water body and send it to laboratories for the water related tests like BODs and all that. So we also the physico-chemical analysis is carried out for select water bodies depending on the requirements that we have for each water body.
And do we also then try and map the biodiversity of that water body? That what kind of fishes do they have and plants do they have?
Yeah.
And
so
what kind of BOD they can have, so that is this a good water body or can it sustain? How much can it sustain, basically?
Yes, as I told you, we do carry out the ecological survey, and when we do, we identify the water body as ecologically sensitive or ecologically not so sensitive. And whenever a water body is classified as ecologically sensitive, obviously it needs that detailed analysis in terms of how it supports the aquatic ecosystem, how it supports various birds, how it supports the native flora. And then so each of these water bodies, we try and classify these water bodies at water bodies that require interventions, water bodies that are very good conditions and probably needs conservation, and water bodies that are ecologically sensitive. We need to probably protect them, preserve them, and probably improve the habitat. And also water bodies that are encroached and they need to be taken care of by the ULBs. So the classification is based on what kind of intervention that we need to actually carry out for each of these water bodies.
True.
So that kind of raises kind of a flag for the ULBs in terms of the way forward to handle that water body. And when the number is large, obviously it's very difficult to get into the specifics of these water bodies. But the idea is once you know that these are the water bodies that requires your immediate attention, and these are the interventions which need to be carried out, your efforts can be directed towards addressing those issues on urgent basis. And obviously, depending on the budget levels of each ULBs or the priorities at each ULB, one can carry out the necessary interventions, restoration efforts, beautification efforts in some cases.
Absolutely. That sounds amazing. And the amount of detail that goes into each mapping of either green cover or water body is immense. So coming back to the technology part, because that does excite me and that does sound interesting to me, that drones are possibly the future, which will help us monitor not just trees, I guess, but water bodies as well, because it will become much more easier. And I'm assuming the kind of technology that we might be looking at is photographic as well as LiDAR imaging to understand the width, girth, everything just by flying around, as well as I'm not sure if that can also work in the depth of the water body, or do we need something else to map the depth of the water body?
Yeah, so depth is we are yet to come across. Normally, you understand the depth and the topography of the water body by taking the bathymetry survey. That's a much more detailed exercise. However, I'm sure the technology will evolve where through the drone we are able to kind of estimate the depth of each of these water bodies at the peak depth of the water body and things related data, which is physically not possible today. One needs to actually carry out geotechnical survey and all that, which may not be possible when you're inventorizing tree of this size. But obviously, when you're doing it for 1 or 2 or 5 water bodies, it's possible to carry out those surveys. But I'm excited. I'm equally excited about the technology, that's unfolding for all of us. And I'm sure in 2-3 years' time, we will have a technology which can give us a lot more data, by just flying drone, taking images which are crystal clear. And I'm sure that day is not far.
Absolutely, because that just makes it so much more easier to map so many more things at a faster rate, which we cannot do today. And I think that is much more required than ever before. So coming again to the point of GHG emissions and how these kind of urban biodiversity help in reducing them. Do you think carbon neutral cities are possible? Because eventually these are the factors which act as sink, and then we are the emitters. We emit everywhere in every possible format. So do you feel how carbon neutral cities are possible, as well as how, if yes, how are they possible?
No, certainly. We have been, very strong and vocal advocates of carbon neutrality, be it for industries and more so with cities. We have, we've already understood the importance of biodiversity, climate change that impacts most of our cities, because we dwell in most of our cities and most of these cities, and we understand the issues, whether it's related to health, whether it's related to mental well-being and all those. So we have been working on this carbon neutrality aspect over the last 4-5 years, and we have developed our own model as to how cities can towards carbon neutrality, and it's very much possible. We've recently heard of how Infosys has gone about targeting carbon neutrality, and they have been able to actually achieve carbon neutrality in 20 years ahead of their schedule. So if a company which is committed, to becoming a carbon neutral company, and if they can achieve this feat, 20 years ahead of its schedule, I'm sure the cities can, at least achieve this. If not ahead of the schedule, at least on time. And each of these cities can actually target becoming carbon neutral over a period of time to improve the quality of the life of the people, to improve the environment, the social environment, the ecological, and all that I think is very, very essential for cities to become livable. And I think, there's a lot more talked about the livability of each of these cities. Now, coming to carbon neutrality as to how we can become. So it's very simple. As I told you, I think to plan any interventions or plan any sort of effort, you need to inventorize what is a problem, right? So it starts with inventorization of GHG emissions at the city level. And there are standard protocols which are available as to how you can do it. It's not a rocket science. There is a proven process, and globally cities have been doing GHG footprinting at the city level. So once you have the footprint city duly mapped, you project it, that over a 5-year, 10-year period, what that footprint is going to be for that city, depending on the variables like the population growth, the development agenda of the cities, and all this is possible. I think you have the models which can actually project it for you. Once you know what my carbon footprint is for the city in over a 5-year or a 10-year period, then the next process for you is how I can systematically reduce my footprint. That's the first step. And you have, technologies now available in terms of energy efficiency, introducing energy efficiency measures, awareness in terms of energy conservation, and then obviously the renewables, introduction of the renewables. That means replacing, the fossil fuel based energy generation with the renewable or the clean energy. And this is how obviously you're able to systematically reduce your GHG emissions over a period of time. Maybe say you can project it for 5 to 10 years. You will still be left with some gap, right? Because you probably cannot achieve zero, because you will still need to have a lot more energy, that is used at the city level. This gap is what needs to be sequestered, as we spoke about it earlier. This gap is what needs to be sequestered by the ecosystems, by the nature that you have in these cities, and more so with the trees that you have, because it's easy for you to calculate carbon sequestration at the tree individual unit level, tree level. So then, because of, and we've already seen how the inventorization of trees can actually help us give us a figure of carbon sequestration through the trees that you have within the city. So once you project it, and there are models available for projecting the carbon sequestration of these trees, the inventorized trees that you have for a period of 5 to 10 years. And then you compare what will still be the gap.
Yeah.
Right, in 5 years or 10 years hence, what will be the gap even after sequestration of the carbon through the trees, the existing trees that you have, and that is the gap is what you have to manage by planting more trees, by introducing ecological features, nature in your city.
Yeah.
And if you do it perfectly, I think it's very, very simple task that over a period of next 5 to 10 years, you can plan it today and you can systematically introduce those ecological features, including plantation of trees, to actually reach a level where you are able to neutralize your GHG footprint. And that's how you can actually become a carbon neutral city.
Absolutely. And I think that is really important as well, because if we don't map out how much we are going to emit, we will not be able to plant trees today, which will eventually have to grow up over next 10 years to be able to sequester that much amount. If you can just, I don't know the numbers, but just for the audience, if you have any idea on numbers that if I plant today, how much a sapling would sequester compared to a 10-year-old tree?
No, Puneet, I don't have exact data, but say a sapling obviously will sequester a very insignificant amount of carbon, because the morphological feature of the sapling are not grown enough to kind of absorb and sequester that carbon. But as that sapling actually keeps growing over a period of 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, and then 10 years, and kind of reaches a stage where it has fully grown leaves and a canopy, beautiful canopy, it is obviously able to sequester. And the sequestration data is right from a tree, say a 5 or a 10-year-old fully grown tree can sequester anywhere from 5-10 kgs annually to about 200 kgs annually.
Wow.
And I'm sure in some instances it can even be higher. That's the variation, and that variation depends on various species. It depends on which species are you planting and how that species kind of grows up over a period of time. So see, sequestration is just one of the benefit that you actually get through the trees. It's not the only benefit that you get. I mean, the trees can benefit you in terms of providing various kinds of ecosystem services. It actually gives you the fruits, it gives you the flowers. They are of importance culturally to you. They release oxygen, obviously, that's one of the biggest stuff. They also end up improvising your soil in terms of soil retention, conservation, nutrient additions to your soil. They maintain the ecological cycle that is very important. All kinds of flora and fauna to actually, survive and thrive around you. It's these are fantastic, features that the trees can actually give, and so therefore all these is additional for you. If you can just sequester the carbon and make your cities carbon neutral, all these benefits are actually going to accrue naturally to you.
Absolutely.
Puneet, I also have a very interesting analogy. I think over the last 10, 12 years of my study about the ecosystems, the trees in detail, and also the global studies that have been carried out. And I'm not alone, but there have been studies that have proven that every unit of investment in a tree has a potential return over its lifetime. No other asset class actually gives you that kind of a return. Wow. It can be in multiples of thousands. To
Wow.
give you a simple example, to plant a tree and to maintain a tree, say for a period of 3 to 5 years,
Yeah.
till the time tree actually survives and thrives. After that, it takes care on its own. It doesn't
Yeah.
need that maintenance. You will end up spending maybe 500 rupees or 1,000 rupees or 2,000 rupees, depending on where you are planting the tree and
Yeah.
what species are you planting. But that investment of 500 to 2,000 rupees can actually give you a value which can even be in crores in some cases over its lifetime.
Wow.
Now, you
Yeah.
can't have this kind of a return for any other asset class.
Absolutely. That's just fascinating number for me as well, because eventually the tree helps you retain more water, which is again a scarce resource in today's world. It helps you lower down your heat in the cities, which is again important to reduce your electricity bills. And yeah,
Right.
it's the amount of advantages that are there are obviously much more than the disadvantage we can even talk about. And I'm not sure if there can be any disadvantage on these lines. So coming to one of the last questions that we generally ask everyone is the different kind of skill sets, because it is something important for, I feel that the audience needs to know and understand if they want to enter in this field, what kind of courses they can study, what kind of skills they can apply. So one of the things that we did talk about was having botanists, having life sciences people, engineers, systems like or products like drone, which will be important in the future. So can you maybe briefly tell us what all, if other kind of skill sets would also be required, or kind of jobs this urban biodiversity field could create in the future?
Yeah, in fact, my observations or our observation as an organization is that there is a dearth of professionals, committed, passionate professionals to carry out this agenda of greening cities, which means obviously improving the urban biodiversity. Uh, we haven't seen many professionals coming up and thriving in that. So I think while conservation is considered as more of an activism,
Yeah,
however, you can any professional can play a very constructive role in greening or improving urban biodiversity, and that point needs to be driven strongly in the younger minds. I think in terms of skill sets. Probably we already have some of these curriculum existing as part of the university programs. What I think is needed to make these programs more effective is actually to expose the students and the professionals more to the field work, expose them in terms of practical application of those knowledges that they acquire in the university. I think that is what I find missing, because everyone who has joined us as a fresher from the college, we have to take a lot of effort in investing in these people, training these
yeah,
people, and exposing them to the practical orientation of the skill set which they have acquired otherwise in a classroom. So I think it's more of orienting them more to the field work and orienting them to how they can use their skill set in practical application. I think that's where probably there has to be more interaction between the industry and the academia
yeah,
and in terms of how the students can be equipped for applying their knowledge rather than just acquiring the knowledge.
yeah. And that's true. That's true. We have been as well in the last year of my work as well. We have also tried that, okay, as much as possible, if applied research comes into play, it will improve the ecosystem in lot many more ways than we can think of. It's just the amount of exposure that will build up for the new generation will be exponential, and eventually they will end up thinking new things that we have never thought of, I think, which is a lot more important. So any last thoughts would you have before parting off?
Certainly, Puneet, I think there's over the last few years of having spent, my time on this organization and also at large, the entire space of ecology and biodiversity. I strongly believe that for India as a country, for it to grow more sustainably, I think we need to focus a lot on nature, protecting nature, identifying nature-related risks, and introduce interventions wherever we can mitigate those risks. And it's all about managing your nature well, because in case of India, two-thirds of our economic output actually is dependent on nature. This includes the entire food chain, the entire natural fiber chain, the entire, the pharmaceutical value chain. If you look at all this, and including the furniture, fixtures, the mining industry, it all is an outcome of what we have inherited as nature. The moment you start disturbing it, obviously the impact of this will be felt and will be constraining a factor for future generations. And nature has the potential, I have put this in one of my blogs, and it has been statistically proven by the World Economic Forum that every dollar or rupee invested in nature actually yields a potential benefit of 8 to 9 times. So a multiplier of 8 to 9 times from the the economic output that you can actually generate for each unit to spend. Normal in economics, we use the standard multiplier is about 4 to 5 times. Now this is like doubling your economic output. So it's the investment in nature is actually one of the best things that one can carry out. And obviously, if you are part of the city and investing in the nature around you in the city, can really help us. Cities become more resilient to climate change. It can become more sustainable, inclusive, all kinds of benefits. So I think that's my last few words of the knowledge that I have acquired, or at least the information that I have been privy to.
Thank you, Mr. Ashok. This surely is a great amount of knowledge that we got today, and I learned a lot from this conversation. I hope our audience has also been able to learn new things about the urban biodiversity. And I hope the nature-based solutions we do apply as much as possible for the future. Thank you, Mr. Ashok.
You have been listening to Understanding the Future podcast. To know more about Climate Center for Cities, visit us at www.c-q.niua.org and follow us on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Instagram. The show is conceptualized, hosted, and produced by Punit Gandhi. You can listen to the show on Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, and Spotify. So don't forget to subscribe to the podcast and share it with your friends and colleagues. Thank you and stay tuned for the next episode.